They put Natalie Wood in front of cameras when she was 4 years old, and they never let her stop performing. Not when she was tired. Not when she was scared. Not when she was a teenager desperate to be ordinary. Hollywood took a Russian immigrant's daughter and turned her into America's sweetheart. And the price was her childhood, her innocence, her chance to discover who she might have been if they'd just let her breathe. She learned to cry on command before she learned multiplication. She understood stage marks and camera angles before she understood her own desires. By 16, she was playing opposite James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, and the rebellion on screen was the only kind she'd ever be allowed to have. Off camera, she was still the little girl her mother controlled completely, the commodity that had to be protected, polished, and sold. The tragedy of Natalie Wood wasn't just that she died young and mysteriously. It was that she spent 43 years trying to become a person instead of a product, trying to find authenticity in a life built entirely on performance. Every relationship was complicated by fame. Every emotion was filtered through the lens of how she'd learned to perform emotion for directors who shouted, "Cut," when it got too real. She married twice, divorced twice, came back for more, searching for something that felt real in a world where everything was staged. She had children and found, briefly, the uncontrived love she'd been chasing. But you can't escape what Hollywood makes you into. The cameras never really stop rolling, and on a boat named Splendor, on a night when the wine flowed and tempers rose and something terrible happened, America's daughter slipped into the dark water and disappeared. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko was born in San Francisco in 1938 to Russian immigrant parents who'd fled revolution and poverty, carrying with them dreams that had calcified into desperation. Her mother, Maria, was a woman who'd been beautiful once and understood, with the clarity of someone who'd lost everything, that beauty was currency. When she looked at her daughter, at those enormous dark eyes, that porcelain skin, those features that seemed sculpted by someone who understood what cameras would love, she saw not a child, but a lottery ticket. Maria had a plan. No, more than a plan. A compulsion, a mission, a willingness to sacrifice anything, especially her daughter's childhood, on the altar of success. She'd heard a fortune teller once say that her second daughter would be famous, would be wealthy, would make the family's dreams come true. Whether the fortune teller actually said this, or whether Maria simply needed to believe it, doesn't matter. She believed it with the fervor of religious conviction, and that belief shaped everything that followed. At 4 years old, Natalia, already renamed Natalie, by a mother who understood that Russian names wouldn't sell in 1940s America, was brought to her first audition. The film was Happy Land, a wartime drama that needed a child to cry on command. Most 4-year-olds can't manufacture tears on cue. Most 4-year-olds don't know how to hit their marks, take direction, or suppress their natural fidgeting. But Maria had been preparing her daughter. She'd taught her that cameras were watching, always watching, and that love was contingent on perfect performance. The director needed the child to cry. Natalie wouldn't or couldn't. Maria, standing just off camera, did what she'd learned worked. She took Natalie's favorite toy, a small butterfly, and tore its wings off in front of her daughter's eyes. Natalie sobbed. The director got his shot. Maria got her daughter a career. And Natalie learned the first of many lessons about what would be required of her. Pain could be manufactured, exploited, and sold. Your suffering was never really yours. It was always for the camera. She became a working child actress almost immediately. Not the lead, not yet, but present, in war films, family dramas, whatever needed a beautiful child with those remarkable eyes. By 1946, at age 8, she landed the role that would make her famous. Susan Walker in Miracle on 34th Street, the little girl who learns to believe in Santa Claus. The irony would become apparent only later. Natalie Wood spent the rest of her life searching for the kind of unconditional love and magic that her most famous childhood role promised. But 8-year-old Natalie, coached by her mother, charmed audiences with a performance that seemed effortlessly natural. Those enormous eyes, capable of expressing both skepticism and wonder, made viewers believe in possibility. The film was a massive hit. Natalie Wood became America's daughter. But America's daughters don't belong to themselves. They belong to studios, to audiences, to the machinery of fame that consumes children and spits out damaged adults. Maria, now validated in her prophecy, tightened her control. Natalie worked constantly, film after film, always the beautiful child, always performing emotions she barely understood. She didn't go to regular school. She didn't have friends her own age, except other child actors who were equally trapped in the machinery. Her childhood became a series of sound stages, dressing rooms, photo shoots, interviews where she smiled and said the lines her mother had rehearsed with her. The money flowed. The family's poverty disappeared. Maria bought a house, nice clothes, a lifestyle built entirely on her daughter's face and talent. And Natalie learned another lesson. She was not a person, but a product, and the product had to keep performing, or the whole structure would collapse. Her value was tied entirely to her ability to make audiences love her. Her own desires, her own fears, her own need to just be a child. None of that mattered against the weight of her family's financial dependence on her continued success. By adolescence, she was exhausted. The dark circles under her enormous eyes had to be covered with heavier makeup. She developed insomnia, a lifelong condition born from years of early call times and the anxiety of constant performance. She wanted to go to regular high school, have friends, date boys without photographers documenting every moment. Maria forbade it. Too risky, too normal. The product had to be protected. The 1950s arrived, and with them, a shift. Natalie was 15, no longer a child, but not yet permitted to be an adult. Hollywood didn't know what to do with teenage girls except make them objects of desire for adult male viewers, or symbols of wholesome youth for family audiences. Natalie was caught between these categories, her body developing while studios still tried to sell her as America's innocent daughter. Then came Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, the film that would change everything. James Dean was 24, playing a troubled teenager with a magnetism that transcended performance. He was method, intense, genuinely suffering on camera in ways that made traditional actors uncomfortable. Natalie, at 16, was assigned to play opposite him, the good girl attracted to the bad boy, the redemptive love interest in his tragedy. But something happened during filming. James Dean, who'd also been shaped and damaged by Hollywood, but had found ways to remain authentic beneath the performance, recognized something in Natalie. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she flinched when her mother appeared on set, the quality of someone who'd been performing so long she'd forgotten, or never known, who she actually was. He was kind to her, not romantically. Dean's interests lay elsewhere, though the studio would hint at a romance for publicity. But he treated her like a person, not a product. He talked to her about acting as truth-telling, not manufacturing. He encouraged her to find something real in the performance, to stop giving directors what they wanted, and start giving herself what she needed. The film was extraordinary, Natalie's performance devastating. When she looked at Dean on screen, audiences saw genuine longing, not for the character, but for the freedom he represented. When she cried, they were real tears for a childhood she'd never had. When she screamed at her parents in the famous scene, she was screaming at Maria, at Hollywood, at the cage she'd been locked in since age 4. Rebel without a cause made Natalie Wood a serious actress. Critics praised her emotional depth. She received an Academy Award nomination at 17. But the cost was becoming visible. She'd given so much of herself to that performance that she felt hollowed out afterward. And then, a month after filming Wrapped, James Dean died in a car crash. The person who'd encouraged her toward authenticity was gone, and Natalie was left with only the machinery again. Maria's control intensified. She accompanied Natalie everywhere, to auditions, to sets, to dates with approved young men. She read her daughter's mail, monitored her phone calls, decided which roles to accept. Natalie was making substantial money now, supporting not just her parents, but extended family. The responsibility was crushing. She couldn't rebel. Too many people depended on her compliance. At 18, she met Robert Wagner. He was 26, already established as a movie star, handsome in the classic Hollywood way, square jaw, easy charm, the kind of man who looked perfect in a tuxedo. More importantly, he represented escape. Maria approved of him. He was successful, stable, respectable. And Natalie, desperate for any form of autonomy, convinced herself that marriage meant freedom from her mother's control. They married in 1957. She was 19 years old, still a teenager, playing at being a wife. The wedding was a massive Hollywood affair. Photographers everywhere, both of them beautiful and young and seemingly perfect. America celebrated the fairy tale. But fairy tales are stories we tell to children, and Natalie had never been allowed to be a child. The marriage was troubled from the start. Natalie discovered that escaping Maria's control meant entering Wagner's. He had ideas about what a wife should be: supportive, domestic, not too successful. But Natalie's career was exploding. She starred in Splendor in the Grass opposite Warren Beatty, a performance so emotionally raw that it earned her another Academy Award nomination. She was becoming not just a star, but an artist, finding in her work the authenticity she couldn't access in her personal life. The filming of Splendor in the Grass was brutal. The role required her to portray a young woman's complete psychological breakdown, the destruction of innocence and hope. Elia Kazan, the director, pushed her relentlessly, demanding vulnerability she'd spent years building walls against. There were scenes filmed in water. Natalie had a lifelong terror of water, stemming from childhood trauma on a film set, and Kazan forced her into the river anyway, her screams of "No, no," captured on film and used in the final cut. But the emotional violence of that shoot also cracked something open. For the first time, Natalie accessed real pain, real fear, real anger in her performance. It wasn't the manufactured emotion of a child actress hitting her marks. It was a woman screaming, and audiences recognized the difference. Her marriage to Wagner couldn't survive her evolution. He wanted the beautiful child bride who'd be content with being Mrs. Robert Wagner. She was becoming Natalie Wood, a complicated, ambitious, damaged woman trying to figure out who she was beneath all the performances. By 1962, they divorced. Tabloids speculated. Maria was furious. Divorce was failure, was scandal, was bad for the product. But for the first time, Natalie made a choice for herself, rather than for everyone else's. Expectations. She had relationships. She was photographed with Warren Beatty, creating Hollywood's beautiful young couple until that flame burned out. There were other men, other attempts at finding something real. But how do you find authenticity when you've been performing since age 4? How do you know what you genuinely feel versus what you've been trained to perform feeling? West Side Story came in 1961, and despite the fact that her singing voice was dubbed by Marnie Nixon, another small betrayal, another way Hollywood took parts of her and replaced them, her Maria was luminous. Dancing through those Technicolor streets, her enormous eyes conveying longing and hope, and the tragic foreknowledge that this love story ends in death, Natalie created magic. But magic on screen doesn't translate to life off camera. She was still alone, still searching, still performing. The 1960s brought both artistic triumphs and personal struggles. She worked with directors she admired, gave performances that showcased her range. But there was an increasing weariness visible in photographs from this era. The dark circles under her eyes were harder to hide. The smile looked more effortful. She'd been working for 20 years by her mid-20s, and the exhaustion was accumulating. In 1969, something unexpected happened. She married Robert Wagner again, the same man she'd divorced 7 years earlier. Friends were baffled. What had changed? The answer, perhaps, was nothing. And that was precisely why she returned. At least Wagner was familiar. At least she knew what kind of unhappiness to expect. There's comfort in familiar pain, in known patterns. And Natalie, at 31, was tired of searching for something better that never seemed to arrive. The second marriage to Wagner was different than the first. They had children, Natasha in 1970, Courtney in 1974. Motherhood gave Natalie something she'd never experienced, a role that felt real. Her daughters needed her, not for performance, but for presence. They didn't care about her box office numbers or her publicity photos. They needed her to be simply there, simply present, simply human. For a few years, she stepped back from constant work. She focused on being a mother, creating for her daughters the childhood she'd never had. She made them breakfast, took them to parks, let them be ordinary children in ways she'd been denied. There was joy in this, genuine joy that cameras couldn't manufacture. But Hollywood doesn't let its daughters retire quietly. The offers kept coming. The financial pressures remained. And somewhere in Natalie, there was still the trained performer who didn't know how to exist without the structure of work, of cameras, of being watched. She returned to acting, balancing motherhood with career in ways that felt perpetually inadequate for both. By the late 1970s, she was in her early 40s, still beautiful, still talented, but operating in a Hollywood that worshipped youth. The roles shifted. She was no longer the ingenue, no longer the love interest for leading men. She was offered mothers, supporting roles, the kind of parts that signal a career's decline. It was humbling and painful for someone who'd been famous since childhood to watch her market value diminish simply because she'd aged. In 1981, she was filming Brainstorm with Christopher Walken. The production was troubled, technical difficulties, budget overruns, tensions on set. But there was also something else. Rumors of an affair between Natalie and Walken, whispers that Wagner was jealous, that the marriage was again fracturing. On Thanksgiving weekend, November 1981, Natalie, Wagner and Walken went to Catalina Island on Wagner's yacht. Splendor. Also present was Dennis Deverne, the boat's captain. What happened over those days has been debated, investigated, and questioned for over 4 decades. What's known, there was drinking, significant drinking. There were tensions between Wagner and Walken, arguments about career and fame and things that were never fully explained. On Saturday night, November 28th, they went to shore for dinner at a restaurant, drank more wine, returned to the yacht around 10 p.m. What happened next is murky. The official story changed multiple times over the years. Wagner claimed he and Natalie argued about her career, about wanting to work more. He said he went to bed, assumed she'd gone to sleep in another cabin. Dennis Davern, the captain, would later say he heard arguing, heard Wagner yelling, heard sounds of a struggle. Christopher Walken, interviewed briefly, said he'd been in his cabin and heard nothing definitive. Sometime around midnight, Natalie Wood ended up in the water. She was wearing a nightgown and a red down jacket. The jacket should have kept her warm, but instead, heavy with water, became an anchor. The dinghy from the yacht was found floating loose nearby. Wagner claimed she must have tried to secure the dinghy, slipped and fallen in. But Natalie was terrified of water, irrationally, deeply terrified in ways everyone who knew her confirmed. Her mother had told her in childhood, with the certainty of prophecy, "You will die in dark water." The fear had haunted her entire life. She'd avoid even swimming pools. On film sets involving water, her terror was visible, sometimes requiring medication to get through scenes. Would she have voluntarily gone onto the slippery swim step of a yacht, in the dark, in a nightgown, to secure a dinghy? Would she have approached the water she'd feared for 43 years? These questions have no good answers. Her body was found the next morning, Sunday, November 29th, floating face down about a mile from the yacht, near Blue Cavern Point. She'd been in the water for hours, the official cause of death, drowning and hypothermia. Fresh bruises on her body suggested she'd struggled, tried to climb back onto the dinghy multiple times, her hands clawing at its smooth surface as the heavy jacket pulled her down, and the cold Pacific sapped her strength. Robert Wagner didn't report her missing for hours. When authorities were finally called, precious time had passed. Dennis Davin, the captain, would later claim Wagner prevented him from immediately turning on searchlights or calling for help, saying they'd search in the morning. By morning, Natalie Wood was dead. The investigation was brief. Wagner was cooperative, tragic, the grieving husband. No charges were filed. The case was closed as accidental death. Hollywood mourned. America mourned. The little girl from Miracle on 34th Street was buried at age 43, and with her went any possibility of knowing what really happened that night. But the questions never stopped. In 2011, the case was reopened after Dennis Davin gave interviews claiming the original investigation had been inadequate, that he'd heard things he'd been pressured not to discuss. The coroner changed the death certificate from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. In 2018, Robert Wagner was named a person of interest, though he was never charged and has refused to be interviewed by investigators. The mystery of Natalie Wood's death overshadows everything else about her life, and that's a final tragedy. She was an extraordinarily talented actress who'd survived a childhood stolen by Hollywood and a mother who'd treated her like property. She'd worked constantly from age 4 to 43, giving performances of remarkable emotional depth, despite never being given the space to discover who she actually was. She'd married twice, divorced twice, searched desperately for authentic connection in a life built entirely on performance. She'd become a mother and found in that role something real, something that didn't require cameras or audiences. She'd aged in the public eye, experiencing the particular cruelty Hollywood reserves for women who dare to grow older while still wanting to work. And she'd died in the water she'd feared all her life, either by accident or by something worse, on a night when the people who were supposed to protect her didn't, or couldn't, or chose not to. The child who'd learned to cry on command for directors, who'd spent decades performing emotions for strangers, died alone in the dark Pacific, and no one heard her final performance. Natalie Wood's legacy is complicated. She was both victim and artist, both product and person, both the manufactured child star and the woman trying desperately to emerge from beneath that construction. She gave us performances of staggering emotional truth despite coming from a place of enforced falseness. She showed us what it costs to be famous from childhood, what happens when you're never allowed to be ordinary, never permitted to discover yourself outside the confines of what others need you to be. America's daughter grew up too fast because America didn't let her be a child. Hollywood took a 4-year-old with remarkable eyes and turned her into a commodity, and the machine that made her successful ultimately destroyed her, whether through the direct circumstances of her death or through the accumulated damage of 40 years of performance. The little girl who made us believe in Santa Claus never got to believe in anything herself, not really, She searched her entire life for something authentic, something real, something that existed independent of cameras and audiences and performance. And whether she found it or not in those final moments, in the dark water that had haunted her dreams since childhood, is something we'll never know. What remains is the work, dozens of films, performances that still resonate, moments of truth captured on celluloid, the enormous dark eyes that showed everything, that couldn't lie, that revealed a soul constantly seeking something Hollywood could never give her, permission to stop performing and just be human. She was 43 when she died, still so young, still so much left to discover about herself, if only she'd been given the time. But time ran out on a November night in 1981, in the water she'd always feared, leaving behind 3 daughters who'd never really know their mother outside the performances, a husband whose role in her death remains questioned, and millions of fans who loved America's daughter without ever really knowing the woman she'd tried desperately to become.